Welcome back, everybody. Why are we in the office today? Well, that's because we're doing another sensor shootout. Now, you might recall previously we did a mid-range mirrorless sensor shootout, comparing the sort of mid-priced bodies from Sony, Canon, Nikon, and Panasonic. You might even be getting deja vu because I'm wearing the exact same shirt. I even got a little cocktail here with me, but this time around it's a little bit different because although we're looking at those same four manufacturers, I now have the highest resolution sensors that each camera company can offer. So in no particular order, I've got the Panasonic S1R II, I have the Sony A7R VI, the brand new latest one, I've got the Canon R5 Mark II, and I've got the venerable Nikon Z8. We're going to be comparing these very similar to how we did it before. I'm Chris Niccolls, this is PetaPixel. Let's find out what happens. Now, just like last time when we're comparing these four sensors, we have to remember we're talking about different brands, of course, different technology, also different lenses. So in all of our tests, I'm shooting all these lenses at f8 to try to keep them all as balanced as possible, but there'll always be differences. You know, technical tests, they're not my favorite because they're not very creative, but it's important to do these things. One thing I can at least keep consistent and be able to rely upon is the memory card choice that we're going to use in these four cameras. We're going with OWC cards. We've used these for a long time, and they've proved themselves to be reliable across many brands of camera. So I can use the same card in all these cameras, and we've got all the types that we need. OWC make fast SD cards, they make fast CF Express Type B cards, and CF Express Type A cards. Now, depending on the card format you choose, you can go with Atlas Pros or Atlas Ultras, and if you have that option, it just gives you different price points and also different speeds. But regardless, they're reliable, they're rugged, and they're fast across all the brands we've tested. And when you get home, you can use OWC's Innergize software. This is really cool. It'll keep your cards updated with the latest firmware. You can check the health of the card, make sure that you've got good longevity on those, and you can also format them completely and cleanly if you want to wipe everything off. For consistency and reliability and speed, check out OWC cards. You can click the link in the description below. So before we get into it, just a little bit of housekeeping here. Remember, we're not judging the actual bodies themselves, performance of the handling or anything like that, or lens choices at all. This is really about understanding the sensors. And although this is basically academic, it's still cool to understand what the highest resolution sensors of each manufacturer can provide you and what the differences are, if really practically anything. Well, we're going to see. The other thing I want to point out is we're doing these tests in very controlled situations. We've got the test chart, we've got our lighting all set up, we're shooting, as I mentioned, everything at f8 to try to keep things as apples to apples as possible. When it comes to the high resolution sensors, just like last time, 3 out of the 4 cameras are roughly the same. 3 out of these 4 cameras have 45-ish megapixels, and it's Sony that again brings an even higher resolution sensor to the table. Now, last time we were talking about the difference between 24 and 33 megapixels. This time it's pretty extreme. 3 of these cameras, you're about 45 megapixels, but the brand new Sony A7R VI has upped the game now to 66 megapixels. So let's see if those extra megapixels really make a difference. We're also going to stick to the same 4 criteria we did last time, which means we're going to be talking about dynamic range, resolution, high ISO performance, and readout speeds, although not necessarily in the exact same order. In fact, because we're talking about high resolution sensors, why don't we start with just raw resolution? First off, we've got different base ISOs. The Nikon is 64, the Panasonic is 80, and the Sony and Canon are both 100. We also have different lenses here that we're testing, and we also have an issue with shutters. See, the Nikon Z8 is electronic shutter only, but the other 3 cameras have both mechanical and electronic shutter. And when you're shooting these cameras, if you want to test things like dynamic range or high ISO performance, you really want to be using the mechanical shutter in most cases, because that will make a difference in those terms. But when it comes to resolution here and looking at the best sharpness that we can get out of these, well, I actually chose to shoot all 4 of these cameras in electronic shutter. And that's because even on a tripod, the mechanical shutter on these high resolution sensors can make a difference. Just that little bit of slap can actually affect your sharpness. And I definitely noticed on electronic shutter mode, at slower shutter speeds, we definitely had a boost in detail. So what can we glean from this test? Well, we can first off see that regardless of what camera you get, image quality is fantastically high with tons of detail. I would say that of the 4 shots that we have here, the Panasonic seems to have the least amount of detail, but it's by a very minor difference. When we look at Canon and Nikon, as far as overall sharpness goes, I'd say they're neck and neck. I don't really see much difference here, and that does make sense. The Sony A7R does have a noticeable improvement in detail. You know, if you were to crop in, for example, those extra megapixels are going to make a difference. You're going to get similar results, but be able to crop in a substantial amount. And if you don't crop, you could print larger, but I again feel like we're getting tons of detail regardless, and most people are not going to notice that much of a practical difference. The last thing I want to end on, these cameras do shoot sort of amalgamations of photos put together to increase your megapixel, these sort of multi-shot modes. Really, the Panasonic's the only one that's practical to use because you can do it in camera. And I thought I would just show you a result from the Panasonic in high res mode. And you can see, given the right situation, like tripod use, it does make a noticeable difference. Regardless, I think you're getting tons of detail on all four of these cameras. Okay, so now it's time to look at high ISO performance. We're shooting all four of these cameras at 6400 ISO. 1/2500th of a second is the shutter speed, so mechanical shutter will not be an issue anymore, and I'm definitely using it because we want to get maximum quality out of these files when possible. And we're shooting all of these at f8. And let's take a look at the results here. Now, when we get to 6400 ISO on these cameras, we are above the second gain step, and some interesting stuff happens. Let's again start with the Panasonic here, which I would say is noticeably softer than the other cameras, but also noticeably cleaner. The noise is not as apparent, and that's because Panasonic puts on some pretty aggressive noise reduction on the raw file baked in when you get above 5000 ISO. And you can see the result of it here. Still a good result, quite clean, but we lose some detail because of it. Now, Canon, this is a really interesting sensor because, you know, the R5 Mark II, this has got a cool sensor that we need to study further. Canon absolutely also apply baked-in noise reduction in all their raw files. We've long often given them a hard time for this, but this particular sensor has a good combination of detail retained, still fairly clean. I like the result I'm getting here, but it's also very similar to the Nikon Z8. You can see side by side, these seem to be competing on a very similar level. Similar kind of noise structure, amount of noise, kind of similar pattern in the midtones and darker tones. And so we're getting excellent combination of detail without too much noise on both cameras. I'm going to end with the Sony here though, because this sensor does have the advantage of not only having quite clean noise, but also just having those extra megapixels. When we talk about noise, megapixels do make a difference because you have to consider that the Sony at a similar viewing distance is going to be less magnified because of those extra megapixels, and the noise looks just similar, but it's got more detail. And at the same time, if I were to crop in or zoom in and magnify more, the Sony would have a very similar look to the other files, but we would be printing larger or magnified tighter, cropped in deeper. So those extra megapixels do give a slight advantage when it comes to this whole image quality thing. Okay, so for our dynamic range test, what we're going to do is underexpose all four cameras and then boost the shadows in post. Now, I'm going to shoot all of these cameras at f8. I'm going to shoot all of them at their base ISO and then use an equivalent shutter speed. And it's going to be anywhere between 200th of a second to 300th of a second in that range, depending on the base ISO. Because of that, I can use mechanical shutter again, and that's important because that's where we're going to get the best dynamic range out of each camera. So I need good lighting. So we've got the test chart behind me there, of course. We're going to shoot that again, and I'm using the Westcott L120Bs. This is our standard setup for all of our testing. I love that they're dimmable, they're powerful. I can change the color, although again, here I'm keeping it right at 5600 Kelvin on both. And I also love the fact that I can use easy attachments like these 2x3 foot Westcott soft boxes. They're rapid boxes that go on really, really quickly. And the most important thing about these lights that I love for the technical work that they do is that they're clean in color, they're consistent. I don't get any banding issues when I'm shooting electronic shutter. They're fantastic for these kind of tests. And if you want to learn more about these particular lights, go to fjwestcott.com, or you can click the link in the description below and see the particular kit that we're using today. Westcott is PetaPixel's preferred lighting gear partner. Okay, let's shoot these tests and see what we get. All right, guys, so we shot everything at equivalent exposures. We're shooting at the base ISO on these cameras, and we've pushed these things to just over 3 stops brighter to see what happens to the shadows. And again, we're going to start things off with the Panasonic. I mean, we're still getting a good result. The noise is not too bad, but we're just lacking a little bit of that detail. Now, when we look at the Canon R5 Mark II, again, this is an interesting result because I do feel like it's got a little bit more detail than the Panasonic, similar noise pattern, but Canon is applying noise reduction in the raw files, they always have. However, There's something about the R5 Mark II sensor. It just seems to handle that noise reduction better. They've tweaked it. Normally I'd expect to see more detail loss, but it seems to hold on to a fair amount of detail while still reducing those noise levels in the raw file. Next, it's going to be the Nikon Z8. This is a great result out of this sensor. I mean, you can see it's cleaner than the Canon. I'd say it's got similar detail overall, like a similar overall semblance of detail, but it's just cleaner looking, just smoother blacks, more clean shadows. Really, really nice result out of that. But at the top, it's still going to be the Sony A7R II. This sensor is doing something a little bit different. I mean, we're pretty sure that it's actually stacking images, shooting 2 shots every time you take a photo and taking the best out of both. And we're getting excellent detail. Those extra megapixels, again, play a part here. We're getting relatively clean noise. But what this Sony A7R II does is something the other cameras can't do. Now, our test, I will admit, we're just pushing shadows. We don't really have the facilities to like measure highlight detail and all that kind of stuff yet properly, measure dynamic range fully, okay? We can only glean so much out of these results. And so in order to give you guys better information, we're gonna again refer to Photons to Photos. Bill Claffey does a great job on his website showing comparative dynamic range amongst all the cameras, because we can only show so much with our tests here. And you can see the triangles there on the Canon R5 Mark II showing good dynamic range, but using noise reduction, although I think Canon's doing a better job with this now than they ever have done in the past. Panasonic and Nikon should have actually very similar results for overall dynamic range. You can see pretty similar there, but again, the Nikon does have a slight advantage. And then we can see that the Sony does have a substantial improvement, probably because of the fact that it's stacking those double images and is able to record better highlight and shadow detail at the same time. Regardless, this is a great resource. Big thanks to Bill Claff for doing all that hard work. But we can see here again a pattern forming overall. So let's look at one final test. Last thing we're going to talk about is the overall readout speed from these sensors, because how fast a sensor can scan actually plays a big part in its video capabilities, what frame rates it can support, how minimal the rolling shutter is going to look when shooting electronic shutter, even things like autofocusing speed overall. And having faster scanning sensors is better. But how do our rankings stack up? Well, at the bottom, it's still going to be Panasonic with the slowest readout speed. And we knew this about this sensor. It's around that 37 millisecond mark. Again, you can go faster, but if you do that, you are going to give up some image quality. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be talking about these things in terms of electronic shutter with maximum image quality retained, and Panasonic is going to be at the bottom. Now for our next camera, when you add more megapixels, it does complicate the issue of sensor scanning speeds, and it's going to be the A7R VI with a relatively slow, just around that 19-20 millisecond mark. We saw this to be a real problem with its predecessor, the A7R V, which had really slow scan speeds, making the electronic shutter almost unusable in a lot of fast action movement situations. So the A7R VI improves things quite a bit over that camera, but you are still going to notice some rolling shutter in more extreme situations, and you got to watch for that. And one of the main reasons we're seeing improvements to these readout speeds is because the Sony is using a stacked chip, as are the next two cameras. The next in line will be the Canon R5 Mark II. Again, this is a really cool sensor, and it dramatically speeds up the readout speeds for electronic shutter, hovering around that 6.5 millisecond range. This is a fantastic result. Anything under 10 basically means that for practical uses, you're not going to see rolling shutter. It's just not going to be an issue. So you can happily shoot the R5 Mark II in electronic shutter mode. Yeah, you suffer a bit of dynamic range loss, but you're going to be able to shoot insanely fast burst rates for fast action in sports. And the best result, it's an oldie but a goodie. It's the Nikon Z8/Z9 45 megapixel sensor. Just under 4 millisecond scan speed is insanely fast, which is why Nikon decided to make these cameras electronic shutter only. You get great results. You can shoot wildlife, sports, fast burst rates without the complications of worrying about any rolling shutter issues. So fantastic result from this older camera. So again, we do these tests in terms of rankings, and that really does mean that the Panasonic S1R II, in comparison to the other three cameras, has some weaknesses. But again, please Let's maintain context. It's incredibly minor. All four of these cameras shoot insanely high detail, great dynamic range, good noise even at high ISOs. I really don't want you guys to get the wrong impression. It's capable of fantastic image quality. Really what's interesting is exactly what we saw with our mid-range shootout, which is that the companies all have different ways of approaching how they want to deal with sensor technology, how they want to deal with image quality issues, and how they want to push that envelope. It's nice to see our results backed up again. When we talked about the R5 Mark II, we were surprised that Canon is still making their own sensors, but they seem to have done a really fantastic job, in particular with this one. It handles that baked-in noise reduction better, great detail, fast scanning sensor, great electronic shutter usage. They truly have made a camera that can do everything in one package. And then the Nikon Z8, what can you say? I mean, you could argue it's an older sensor, but according to our rankings, that doesn't seem to be a factor. It's fast, it's got good detail, good noise. I mean, handles dynamic range issues, no problem. They're doing a fantastic job, and I think that's why Nikon users are so loyal to those cameras. But again, we also see the dominance of Sony being a semiconductor manufacturer. I mean, they just seem to make fantastic sensors across the board, and we are getting a large megapixel increase over the other cameras, and that does absolutely have benefits in certain situations. I know there's sort of an attitude that megapixels are not the be-all end-all, and I do agree with that in a lot of cases, but there are advantages when it comes to high ISO performance, there are advantages when it comes to cropping, and if you did want to print insanely large. That being said, all of these cameras are capable of very high resolution, but Sony seems to be, again, addressing dynamic range issues by doing this stacking of multiple images. It's very similar to what we saw with the A7 IV when we did the mid-range shootout. We're seeing that again here on the A7R VI. I think the final conclusion we can make, though, is no matter who you go with nowadays, we're spoiled with fantastic image quality. And if you want resolution, but you still want shooting speeds and dynamic range, you don't have to really compromise much anymore. I appreciate you guys joining us here with our tests, and let the "my brand is better than your brand" fest begin in the comments below. We always love that. We'll probably talk about our results here a little bit more too on the PetaPixel podcast, but it's also a great place to talk about the latest in photographic news, interesting photographers, and cool events and cool technology. I think you guys should check it out on this exact same channel or listen to it on all your favorite podcasting apps. Do consider getting a PetaPixel.com membership. We keep adding perks all the time. Look at the list. $3 a month, $30 a year. It gets better and better for value almost every day, literally. Anyways, thanks so much for joining us, guys. We'll see you soon with more on PetaPixel.